There is a certain kind of silence that haunts the great country manors of the world. It's a silence steeped in history, in old money, and in secrets that have been absorbed by the very stone of the walls. These houses have seen generations come and go, fortunes built, and dynasties crumble. But what happens when that silence is broken by a murder so cold, so precise, that it feels like the house itself was the killer? Tonight, we're unlocking the gates of a secluded, Gothic estate, where a beautiful young heiress was found dead, the last in a long and cursed line. This is a story about a fortune built on a forgotten crime, and the quiet, unassuming butler who, for a lifetime, had been patiently waiting to serve one final, and very cold, dish of revenge. Before we walk the long, gravel driveway to the heart of this mystery, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the final, shocking revelation from behind the servant's door. Now the house is quiet. The investigation is about to begin. Blackwood Manor was not so much a house as it was a scar on the landscape. A magnificent, sprawling Gothic revival mansion. It stood on a secluded rise of land, surrounded by a dense, ancient forest and miles of rolling, misty moorland. It was a place of dramatic, granite-gray turrets, of ivy-clad walls that seemed to weep with the perpetual damp of the English countryside, and of tall, mullioned windows that stared out at the world like the vacant, unforgiving eyes of a long-dead ancestor. For a century and a half, it had been the seat of the Sterling family, a dynasty whose immense fortune, built in the dark, rapacious days of the Industrial Revolution, was rumored to be as cursed as it was vast. The last of that long, and supposedly cursed, line was a young woman named Isabella Sterling. At 25, she was the sole inheritor of the Sterling fortune and of the magnificent and deeply oppressive house itself. She was a creature of almost mythical rarity, a beautiful, fragile, and intensely private heiress who rarely ventured beyond the wrought iron gates of her estate. The local villagers spoke of her in hushed, almost superstitious tones, calling her the porcelain doll of Blackwood Manor. A beautiful, perfect, and deeply breakable object, trapped in a life of immense wealth and profound, suffocating loneliness. On a cold, rain-swept October morning, the fragile porcelain world of Isabella Sterling was shattered. She was found dead. She was discovered not by a family member, for she had none, but by the one constant in her isolated life, her butler. His name was Arthur Finch. A man in his late 60s, Finch was the perfect, almost cinematic embodiment of his profession. Tall, rail-thin, with a face of quiet, dignified composure and eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He had served the Sterling family for over 40 years, first as a footman, and for the last 2 decades, as the manor's impeccable and utterly devoted butler. It was he who made the calm and utterly professional call to the local constabulary. Detective Chief Inspector Miles Corbin and his partner, Detective Sergeant Eva Rostova, arrived to a scene that was heavy with a silence that felt older and more profound than the mere absence of sound. Corbin was a man in his late 50s, a homicide detective of the old school, a man of solid, reassuring bulk and a deep-seated cynicism that had been earned over 30 years of wading through the worst and most predictable of human nature. He had a profound distrust of the wealthy, believing that their money simply gave them more elegant and expensive ways to commit the same grubby old sins. Rostova was his opposite in almost every way. She was younger, sharper, more analytical, a woman who saw the world not as a simple morality play, but as a complex and often beautiful tapestry of details. She was a detective who understood that environments held echoes, that a place as old and as saturated with history as Blackwood Manor had a story to tell, if you only knew how to listen. Arthur Finch, his face a perfect, tragic mask of controlled grief, met them at the massive, oak front door. "This way, Inspector," he said, his voice a low, steady, and impeccably modulated baritone that seemed to absorb and neutralize the chaotic energy of the police arrival. "Miss Isabella is in the library." It was her favorite room. The library was a magnificent, 2-story cavern of dark, polished wood and the intoxicating scent of old books and beeswax. Tens of thousands of leather-bound volumes rose to a high, vaulted ceiling. A grand, unlit fireplace stood at one end of the room, and a massive bay window looked out onto the rain-swept, autumnal gardens. Isabella Sterling was seated in a large, velvet wingback chair near the window. A book of poetry lay open, face down, in her lap. A delicate, porcelain teacup and saucer sat on the small, antique table beside her. A tartan blanket was draped neatly over her knees. She was dressed in a simple, elegant cream-colored cashmere sweater. Her long, dark hair was tied back with a silk ribbon, and her beautiful, pale face was tilted slightly to one side, as if she had simply and peacefully drifted off to sleep while reading, lulled by the gentle, rhythmic sound of the rain against the thick, leaded glass. But her skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor, and her eyes, just visible beneath her long lashes, were open in a fixed, vacant stare. The teacup, Corbin noted, was empty, save for a few dried dregs at the bottom. The local GP was the first on the scene, Finch explained, his voice unwavering, though his hands, clasped tightly behind his back, betrayed a slight tremor. He could not determine a cause of death. There are no marks, no signs of any kind of struggle. He said it appeared to be a sudden and very peaceful natural event. A heart failure, perhaps. But Corbin, who had seen death in all its forms, knew this was not a natural event. This was a crime scene. A strangely, unnervingly, and almost offensively perfect crime scene. The investigation began, a slow, methodical intrusion into the silent, self-contained world of the manor. The first and most glaring problem was that of access. There were no signs of a forced entry. The manor's ancient, but surprisingly robust, security system had not been triggered. The killer, it seemed, had either been invited in or they had a key. The list of suspects, while not long, was a classic tableau of wealth, greed, and resentment. First, and most obviously, there was Isabella's only living relative, a distant cousin named Julian Croft. A charming but notoriously profligate art dealer from London, Julian was the sole, and now very, very wealthy heir to the entire Sterling fortune. He had visited the manor just 2 days before the murder, a visit that Finch described, with a delicate, diplomatic wince, as contentious. Julian, it was well known, had been pressuring Isabella to sell the manor and its priceless art collection, a suggestion she had vehemently and repeatedly rejected. Next, there was Isabella's recent, and very secret, ex-lover, a handsome and much older local art historian named Leo Vance. Their tumultuous, year-long affair had ended abruptly a month prior, when Isabella had, for reasons she had not explained, cut him off completely. Vance, they discovered, was in a precarious financial situation, and it was rumored that he had been hoping to marry the young heiress and her fortune. And finally, there was the family lawyer, a slick and deeply inscrutable man named Marcus Blackwood. Blackwood was the trustee of the Sterling estate, the man who controlled the vast and complex financial machinery of the family's fortune. He was a man who held all the keys, both literally and figuratively, to Isabella's world. But the central and most crucial witness, the man at the very hub of the entire intricate wheel of the manor's life, was the butler Arthur Finch. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia of the Sterling family. He knew the schedules, the habits, the secrets. He provided the detectives with a flawless, minute-by-minute account of Isabella's final days. He was a model of quiet, efficient, and deeply grieving cooperation. He seemed less like a suspect and more like a co-investigator. Miss Isabella was a creature of routine, Inspector, Finch explained, his voice filled with a genuine paternal sadness. She took her breakfast at 8, her walk in the gardens at 11, her lunch at 1, and her afternoon tea in the library at precisely 4 o'clock. Always, it was her one, small, daily comfort. "And you prepared this tea?" Rostova asked, her eyes sharp and observant. "Of course, Sergeant," Finch replied with a faint, sad smile. "For 20 years, I have had the honor of preparing Miss Isabella's afternoon tea. It was a ritual we shared." The preliminary report from the medical examiner came back late that night, and it confirmed what Corbin's gut had been telling him all along. Isabella Sterling had not died of natural causes. She had been poisoned. The poison was a rare and incredibly sophisticated alkaloid toxin derived from the water hemlock plant. It was a poison that induced rapid paralysis of the central nervous system, mimicking the symptoms of a sudden, massive stroke or heart attack. It was tasteless, odorless, and, in the small, potent dose that had been used, would have been completely undetectable in a simple cup of tea. It was a silent and almost perfect murder weapon. The investigation now had a sharp, deadly focus. The killer was not just a greedy relative or a jilted lover. They were someone with a knowledge of and access to rare botanical poisons. Someone who knew Isabella's routine intimately. Someone who could have tampered with the tea she drank, alone in her library, every single day. As the detectives worked late into the night, in a makeshift office they had set up in the Manor's grand and frigid dining room, Rostova found herself wrestling with a single, nagging, and deeply unsettling thought. The crime scene was too perfect. Isabella's body was too peacefully arranged. The story was too neat. It felt staged. It felt less like the chaotic, messy aftermath of a real murder, and more like a single, perfectly composed, and deeply fictional final chapter. Driven by this intuition, she decided to take another, closer look at Isabella's life, not just her final days, but her deeper passions. Finch had told them that Isabella had become increasingly reclusive in the past year, spending most of her time in the library, consumed by what he had called a rather morbid fascination with the family's history. Late that night, long after Corbin had retired to the local inn, Rostova returned to the library. The room was now a sealed and silent crime scene, bathed in the cold blue light of a single forensic lamp. She was not looking for physical evidence, but for something else. A clue to Isabella's state of mind. She scanned the thousands of books, and her eyes settled on a section that was not filled with the classic literature or poetry she would have expected. It was a section dedicated to the history of the Industrial Revolution, filled with dense, scholarly tomes on 19th-century finance, industry, and law. And behind a row of these books she found it. A small, almost invisible section of the ornate, carved wood paneling was loose. She gently pried it open. It revealed not a safe, but a small, hidden, and climate-controlled alcove. Inside was not jewelry or money, but a collection of old, leather-bound journals, a series of faded, sepia-toned photographs, and a stack of yellowed, brittle newspaper clippings. It was Isabella's secret research project. The journals were the private diaries of her great-great-grandmother. The clippings all detailed the sudden and mysterious financial ruin and subsequent disappearance of a rival industrialist family, a family named Finch, who had been the Sterling's chief competitors in the 19th century. The final clipping was a small, tragic notice of the suicide of the patriarch of the Finch family, a man named Arthur Finch I. Rostova felt a cold, electric chill run down her spine. Finch. It had to be a coincidence. A strange and deeply unsettling coincidence. But as she looked at one of the old, faded photographs, a formal portrait of the entire doomed Finch family from the 1870s, she saw him. The patriarch Arthur Finch I, a man with a proud, handsome face and a quiet, dignified composure. A man who, despite the century and a half that separated them, and the vast difference in their social standing, bore a stunning and absolutely undeniable resemblance to the quiet, dignified, and impeccable Butler who had so calmly and so professionally reported the murder of the last living Sterling. The discovery of Isabella Sterling's secret research and the stunning, impossible resemblance between the 19th century patriarch of the ruined Finch family and the 21st century Butler of the triumphant Sterling family was a lightning bolt that completely reconfigured the landscape of the investigation. The case was no longer a simple, modern-day story of greed and inheritance. It was a ghost story, a historical drama, a tale of a century-old curse that had suddenly and violently resurfaced. Detective Rostova knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling, that the key to this murder lay not in the present, but deep in the dark and very bloody soil of the past. Her first and most delicate challenge was to convince her partner. DCI Corbin was a man of the here and now, a detective who dealt in the tangible, brutal realities of modern crime. The idea of a 150-year-old vendetta being the motive for a present-day murder was, to him, the stuff of the Gothic novels that filled the dead heiress's library, not the stuff of a real police investigation. "So, what are you saying, Eva?" he grumbled, as she laid out the old, faded photographs and the brittle newspaper clippings on the grand, polished table of their makeshift incident room. "The butler, our perfect, helpful, and deeply boring butler, is some kind of avenging ghost, the reincarnation of his great-great-grandpappy, here to settle an old score? It's a bit far-fetched, even for this loony bin." "I'm not saying he's a ghost, Miles," Rostova replied, her voice calm and steady, her belief in her theory unshaken. "I'm saying he's a descendant, and I'm saying that this isn't a coincidence. The name, the face, the fact that Isabella was secretly and obsessively researching this very family. It's all connected. The motive for this murder isn't about the future of the sterling fortune. It's about the past." While Corbin, still skeptical but intrigued, agreed to let her pursue her historical rabbit hole. He focused his own, considerable investigative energy on the more conventional, and in his mind, more probable suspects. The case against the greedy cousin, Julian Croft, was growing stronger by the day. They had discovered that Croft was not just in debt. He was on the brink of catastrophic financial ruin, with a string of angry creditors and a looming bankruptcy hearing. The sterling inheritance was not just a windfall for him. It was a lifeline. His alibi, that he was at a gallery opening in London on the night of the murder, was proving to be flimsy. Several witnesses could place him there, but no one could account for his whereabouts for a crucial, 2-hour period in the middle of the evening, a window of time in which he could have easily driven to the manor, committed the crime, and returned to the city. The case against the jilted lover, Leo Vance, was also solidifying. A search of his cottage revealed a collection of angry, unsent letters to Isabella, letters that spoke of betrayal, of broken promises, and of a deep, and increasingly desperate, love that had curdled into a bitter resentment. And a quiet conversation with a local botanist revealed that Vance, an avid and knowledgeable gardener, had recently purchased several plants for his garden, including a specimen of the highly toxic water hemlock. But for Rostova, these suspects, with their loud, passionate, and obvious motives, felt like a deliberate misdirection, a noisy modern-day drama designed to distract from the quiet, ancient tragedy she had uncovered. She dedicated herself to reconstructing the story of the two families, the Sterlings and the Finches. From Isabella's secret research, and from her own, deep dives into historical archives, a dark and terrible story emerged. In the mid-19th century, the patriarchs of the two families, a ruthless industrialist named Silas Sterling and a brilliant, innovative inventor named Arthur Finch I, had been business partners. Finch was the genius, the inventor of a revolutionary new weaving loom that was set to transform the textile industry. Sterling was the money, the charismatic, and utterly ruthless businessman. On the eve of filing their joint patent, Silas Sterling had betrayed his partner. Through a combination of forged documents, bribery, and outright theft, he had stolen the patent, claimed the invention as his own, and had systematically and brutally ruined Arthur Finch, driving him into bankruptcy and public disgrace. The Sterling fortune was built not on genius or hard work, but on a single monumental act of theft. The story of Arthur Finch's subsequent suicide, and the complete and mysterious disappearance of his destitute family, was the foundation stone, the dark, bloody secret, upon which the entire, glittering Sterling dynasty was built. Armed with this knowledge, Rostova began a new and highly confidential line of inquiry. She ran a deep, forensic background check on the one person who seemed to have no motive, no past, and no secrets, the butler, Arthur Finch. His official records were, like the man himself, impeccable. A lifetime of loyal service, a clean record, a life of quiet, unassuming dignity. But Rostova, using a specialized genealogical tracking service, began to build his family tree going back generations. And there it was, the truth, hidden in plain sight for 40 years. Arthur Finch, the butler, was Arthur Finch IV. He was the great-grandson of the man who had been destroyed by Silas Sterling. He was the last living and direct descendant of the ruined Finch family. The motive was no longer a theory, it was a certainty. This was not a murder for money. This was an act of vengeance, a 150-year-old debt being paid in full. But the central question remained, why now? Why, after 40 years of quiet, loyal, and seemingly devoted service, would Arthur Finch choose this moment to exact his revenge? The answer, Rostova knew, had to lie with Isabella. She went back to the secret research room, to the diaries of Isabella's great-great-grandmother. As she carefully read through the faded, spidery script, she found what she was looking for. The matriarch of the Sterling family had been racked with guilt over her husband's crime. In her final, dying days, she had written a secret codicil to her will, a document that had been hidden and forgotten for over a century. In it, she decreed that if a legitimate heir of the Finch family could ever be found, a significant portion of the Sterling fortune was to be paid to them in restitution, as a way of cleansing the family's soul of this dark and terrible stain. Isabella, in her obsessive research, had found this document, and her final journal entries, which Rostova now read with a sense of dawning, tragic clarity, revealed her plan. She had been so horrified by the truth of her family's history that she had decided to honor the wishes of her long-dead ancestor. Her secret research had not just been about uncovering the past. It had been about rectifying it. She had been using private investigators to try and track down any living descendants of the Finch family, with the intention of revealing the truth to the world, and of making a public and very, very large financial restitution. This was the catalyst. This was the trigger. Arthur Finch had not killed Isabella out of simple, historical hatred. He had killed her to stop her. Rostova presented her theory, now complete and backed by a mountain of historical and genealogical evidence, to a stunned, and now completely convinced, DCI Corbin. He's been playing a long game, a very long game, Rostova said, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and a kind of grudging, professional admiration. He infiltrated this house, the very heart of his enemy's empire, 40 years ago. He has served them impeccably for his entire adult life. He has watched them live and thrive on the profits of his family's destruction. It's a revenge of an almost biblical scale. But why kill her now? Corbin asked, the final piece of the puzzle still eluding him. If she was about to give him a fortune, to restore his family's name, why not let her? Why not take the money and the victory? Because it wasn't about the money, Rostova replied, the final, chilling piece of the psychological puzzle clicking into place. It was never about the money. It was about the grievance. It was about the purity of his family's victimhood. For him, a public apology, a financial settlement, that's not justice. That's a transaction. It would have turned his family's epic tragedy into a simple, sordid business deal. It would have allowed Isabella, a Sterling, to be the hero of the story, the benevolent, redeeming figure. It would have cleansed the Sterling name. And that is the one thing he could not and would not allow. He needed them to remain the villains. He needed his family to remain the martyrs. Her act of goodness was a threat to his entire identity, to the very purpose of his long and terrible life. The motive was now complete, a perfect and perfectly monstrous piece of psychological clockwork. The quiet, dignified, and loyal Butler was not just a killer. He was the self-appointed curator of a 150-year-old injustice, a man who would kill not for a fortune, but for the purity of his own and his family's suffering. The full, shocking, and deeply tragic scope of Arthur Finch's motive was now laid bare. He was not a common criminal, but the final, terrifying product of a historical injustice. A man whose entire life had been a performance, a long and patient act of infiltration and silent, simmering rage. Detectives Corbin and Rostova knew that their final confrontation with him could not be a simple, by-the-book interrogation. To break a man who had maintained a flawless facade for 40 years, they would need not just evidence, but a stage. They decided to set that stage in the one place where all the threads of this long, dark story converged. The magnificent two-story library where Isabella Sterling had taken her last breath, and where Arthur Finch had, for so long, played the part of the perfect, loyal servant. They summoned him to the library under the pretense of needing to clarify a final, minor detail about the household inventory for the official report. He arrived, as always, impeccably dressed, his posture perfect, his expression one of quiet, dignified sadness. He was still inhabiting his role so completely that it seemed to have become his only reality. "Mr. Finch," Corbin began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the thousands of books that surrounded them. "We're almost ready to close our investigation. We've arrested the cousin, Julian Croft. The evidence is substantial. It was a lie, a classic piece of police misdirection, designed to gauge Finch's reaction. But the butler's composure was absolute. That is very sad news, Inspector," he said, his voice a perfect and almost believable note of sorrow. "Though, I must confess, not entirely surprising. Mr. Croft was always a man of volatile appetites. He had not taken the bait. It was time for a different approach." Rostova, who had been standing quietly by the massive bay window, stepped forward. She was holding a single old, leather-bound journal in her gloved hands. It was the diary of Isabella's great-great-grandmother. "We're not here to talk about Julian Croft, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet, but clear and resonant in the silent, cavernous room. And she had used his first name, a subtle but significant breach of the formal barrier that had always existed between them. She did not accuse him of murder. Instead, she began to tell him a story she had pieced together from the journals, from the archives, from the faded newspaper clippings. The story of Silas Sterling and Arthur Finch I. She laid out the historical crime, the betrayal, the theft, not as an accusation, but as a profound and long-buried tragedy that she had uncovered. As she spoke, a change for the first time came over the butler. His perfect, stoic composure did not crumble, but a new and deeply chilling stillness came over him. The mask of the grieving servant was gone, and the man underneath, a man of formidable and ancient anger, was revealed. "And we found this," Rostova said, her voice soft, as she opened the journal to a marked page. It was the secret codicil, the dying wish of the Sterling matriarch to make restitution. "Isabella found it, too. That's what she was doing, wasn't she? Her secret project. She was trying to find you, to find the last living heir of the Finch family. She wanted to give you back what was stolen from your family." She paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "So the only question we have, Arthur, is why? Why would you kill the one person in 150 years who was trying to give you justice?" The silence that followed was profound. Arthur Finch stared at Rostova, and for a moment, she saw the full, terrible weight of the 4 decades he had spent living a lie. And then he began to speak, his voice no longer the soft, modulated tone of a servant, but the hard, clear voice of a man finally, after a lifetime, telling his own story. "Justice?" he said, the single word a quiet, contemptuous explosion in the silent room. "You call that justice? A rich girl's guilt-ridden, charitable whim? A financial transaction to cleanse her family's dark and terrible stain? My family wasn't stained, detective. My family was erased. My great-grandfather didn't just lose his patent. He lost his name, his mind, his life. My grandfather lived and died in poverty, a broken man. My father worked himself to an early grave in a factory that should have been his. And I have spent my entire life walking these halls, dusting the portraits of the men who destroyed us, serving their children, their grandchildren, living and breathing the foul air of their success. That is the legacy of the Finch family, a legacy of perfect and absolute victimhood. It was a confession, delivered with the cold, hard, and unforgiving conviction of a zealot. Her plan," he continued, his eyes burning with a righteous and terrifying fire, "was the final and most unforgivable insult. She was going to make it all clean. She was going to turn our epic, multi-generational tragedy into a heartwarming story of reconciliation and redemption. She, a Sterling, would have been the hero. the benevolent heiress who righted an old wrong. And I, a Finch, would have been the grateful recipient of her charity. She would have redeemed the sterling name with my family's blood money. And in doing so, she would have destroyed the one thing I had left. The one thing that was truly and purely mine. The absolute, unblemished purity of my grievance. He had killed her not to stop her from keeping the money, but to stop her from giving it away. He explained with a chilling and almost proud detachment how he had done it. The poison was simple, elegant, and untraceable. An extract from the water hemlock plants that grew wild and unnoticed in a damp, forgotten corner of the manor's vast gardens. He, an amateur botanist, was the only one who knew of their existence. The delivery system was the ultimate betrayal of trust. The afternoon tea, the ritual that he and he alone had shared with her for 20 years. She trusted me completely, he said, a note of final and terrible irony in his voice. I was her one constant, her guardian, her friend. In the end, it was the one true sterling virtue, their absolute and blind faith in their own superiority and the loyalty of their servants, that was their undoing. His confession was complete. He was not a madman. He was a man who had been driven to a state of profound and monstrous sanity by a single, all-consuming idea. He was the self-appointed executor of a historical justice that was so absolute, it had no room for forgiveness, for grace, or for a good woman's attempt to right an ancient wrong. As Corbin stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the dim afternoon light of the library, to formally arrest him, Arthur Finch showed no fear, no remorse. He simply stood up, tall and straight, and for the first time in 40 years, he looked like the master of the house. "My name," he said, his voice clear and strong, "is Arthur Finch, and my service is, at last, complete." Arthur Finch was arrested, and his story, when it was finally revealed, sent a shockwave through the quiet countryside. The great, dark secret of Blackwood Manor, the so-called Sterling Curse, was finally brought into the light. The quiet, unassuming Butler, the man who had been hiding in plain sight for a lifetime, had finally and brutally balanced the books. In the end, the grandest houses often hide the deepest and darkest of secrets. Arthur Finch's story is a chilling reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that the debts of one generation are sometimes paid, in blood, by another. He was a butler who served a single terrible dish for 40 years, a dish of cold and very, very patient revenge. A reminder that behind the most loyal of faces can lie the most wounded and the most dangerous of hearts. Thank you for joining us for this look inside the secret world of Blackwood Manor. If you believe that the most compelling mysteries are the ones that are generations in the making, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. We have many more houses to haunt. The gates are now closed. This case is closed.